On a Saturday afternoon in July of 1892, a young anarchist wearing a new black suit pushed open an office door in downtown Pittsburgh and fired 2 bullets at close range. The target survived. He was rushed to his mansion in the city's East End, where doctors extracted 1 bullet from his neck and another from his back. 11 days later, in that same house, his infant son died. The boy had been born just weeks before the shooting. He lived less than a month. The building still stands at the corner of Penn and South Homewood Avenues. Clayton, a 4-story chateau wrapped in pale stucco, sits on 10 acres of manicured gardens in what was once Pittsburgh's Millionaire's Row. Every other mansion from that vanished street is gone. This one survived because the people who lived there understood preservation differently than their neighbors. They did not preserve beauty. They preserved evidence. This is the story of Clayton, the last intact mansion from the age when steel built fortunes and fortunes built palaces. For more than a century, this house has contained secrets. Some of them it has kept. Others it has finally begun to tell. Before we step inside one of America's last Gilded Age mansions, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below, and if you're fascinated by stories of industrial empires, family tragedies, and the price of American power, subscribe so you don't miss our next journey into the world the robber barons built. Chapter 1. The Dust and the Dealer. The land Clayton occupies was nothing special when Benjamin Vandervoort decided to build there. Point Breeze in the 1860s was farmland punctuated by modest homes, a neighborhood on the eastern edge of Pittsburgh that had not yet understood what it would become. The occasional family of means might construct a residence along Penn Avenue, but the street bore no resemblance to the glittering procession of palaces it would eventually house. The soil grew vegetables. The air smelled of crops, not coal smoke. Vandervoort was Pittsburgh-born, a manufacturer who had risen through the city's industrial ranks to become vice president of the Fahnestock White-Lead Company. White-lead was unglamorous work. It involved mining, chemical processing, and the production of paint pigments that made other people's buildings beautiful. The work made Vandervoort prosperous without making him famous. He married Caroline Ringgold Fahnestock, daughter of the company's founder, in a union that combined affection with sound business strategy. Sometime between 1866 and 1870, the couple commissioned the construction of an 11-room house in the Italianate style. The architect's name has been lost to history, but the building he designed was conventional for its era. 2.5 stories of modest elegance fronted by a covered carriage drive. The house sat on 1.5 acres of land, enough for gardens and the suggestion of estate living without the expense of genuine grandeur. The Vandervoorts named it Homewood. They lived there through the transformation of Pittsburgh from a regional manufacturing center into the forge of industrial America. The city's iron and steel production exploded. Fortunes materialized overnight for men who understood how to convert Pennsylvania's natural resources into the raw materials of modernization. Coal became coke. Coke became steel. Steel became railroads, bridges, buildings. The physical infrastructure of a nation expanding westward at terrifying speed. Men who had worked as bookkeepers and farmers suddenly commanded wealth that would have seemed fantastic a generation earlier. Vandervoort participated in this transformation. By 1882, he had become one of the original members of the Carnegie Steel Company, positioning himself within the network of industrialists who were reshaping American capitalism. He did not live to see how completely that network would dominate the economy. Benjamin Vandervoort died in 1882 at age 46. His widow faced a decision. She could maintain the house alone or sell it to someone from the rising generation of industrial titans. That summer, she accepted an offer of $25,000, approximately $790,000 in today's currency. The buyer was 32 years old, and he had been married less than a year. He was already a millionaire. His name was Henry Clay Frick. He had just entered into partnership with Andrew Carnegie. Within a decade, he would become one of the most powerful and most hated men in America. The house he purchased would witness the consequences of that power. It would hold violence and grief in quantities that would have horrified the Vandervoorts. It would survive for more than a century as evidence of what industrial fortunes cost and what they bought. When the sale closed in August of 1882, the house changed names along with ownership. Frick called it Clayton, a name that honored the clay in his own given name. The gesture was pure vanity, but vanity of a specific kind. Frick was not interested in false modesty. He had worked for what he possessed. He intended everyone to know it. Chapter 2. The Mennonite's Son. Henry Clay. Frick was born on December 19, 1849, in West Overton, Pennsylvania, a rural village 40 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. His mother's family owned the old Overholt whiskey distillery. His father's family owned very little. John W. Frick tried his hand at farming and failed. He attempted various business ventures and failed. His son would inherit his stubbornness without inheriting his incompetence. The boy grew up in modest circumstances that bordered on poverty. Watching his grandfather Abraham Overholt accumulate wealth from whiskey, while his own father struggled to feed his family. The lesson was not lost on young Henry. Prosperity did not arrive through prayer or patience. It arrived through calculation and ruthlessness. The Mennonite faith that surrounded his childhood taught humility and community. Frick absorbed the discipline without accepting the doctrine. His formal education ended by the mid-1860s. He worked as a farmhand on his father's unsuccessful farm. He worked as a bookkeeper in his uncle's store in Mount Pleasant. He demonstrated an aptitude for numbers that would serve him throughout his life, developing an expertise in accounting that allowed him to see opportunities others missed. When he looked at the coal seams that ran beneath the hills of southwestern Pennsylvania, he did not see fuel. He saw profit. Coal in its raw form burned inefficiently. Converted into coke through a controlled heating process, it became the essential ingredient for steel production. In 1871, at age 21, Frick borrowed money from family connections and formed a partnership with 2 cousins and a friend. They built 50 beehive ovens to convert coal into coke. The venture was precisely timed. Pittsburgh's steel industry was accelerating toward dominance. Demand for coke was virtually unlimited. 2 years later, the Panic of 1873 devastated the American economy. Banks failed. Businesses collapsed. Fortunes evaporated. For most people, the panic meant ruin. For Frick, it meant opportunity. With credit tight and competitors desperate, he bought out failing coke operations at fractions of their value. What had been a modest partnership became a growing empire. By 1880, Frick needed capital to expand further. He turned to Andrew Mellon, a childhood friend whose family operated one of Pittsburgh's most powerful banks. Mellon recognized genius when he saw it. He provided the financing that allowed Frick to buy out his remaining partners and assume complete control. The company was renamed H.C. Frick and Company. It operated 1,000 coke ovens. It controlled 80% of Pennsylvania's coal output. Henry Clay Frick was 29 years old. He was worth more than $1 million. A business associate later described him as absolutely cold-blooded, more like a machine without emotion or impulses than a human being. The assessment came from Charles Schwab, himself no stranger to industrial ruthlessness. If Schwab found Frick mechanical, the observation carried weight. Frick did not collect friends. He collected assets. He did not pursue popularity. He pursued dominance. In December of 1881, he married Adelaide Howard Childs, daughter of a Pittsburgh boot and shoe manufacturer. She was 22. He was 32. The marriage combined genuine affection with social advancement. Adelaide brought connections to Pittsburgh's established mercantile class. Frick brought wealth that was already beginning to dwarf anything her family had accumulated. They honeymooned in New York, where Frick was introduced to Andrew Carnegie. The meeting changed American industrial history. Carnegie had built the largest steel company in the nation. He needed a reliable supply of coke. Frick controlled that supply. In 1882, their companies merged. Frick became chairman of Carnegie Steel. He was 32 years old. He commanded an industrial empire. He purchased a house in Pittsburgh's East End as a belated wedding gift for his wife. The $25,000 he paid for Clayton represented less than 3% of his net worth. He could have afforded something far grander. He chose modesty, at least initially. The house was respectable without being ostentatious. It announced arrival without demanding attention. That calculation would change. Within a decade, Frick would transform the 11-room Italianate structure into a 22-room chateau. But in 1882, the modest house suited his purposes. He had a fortune to build. The mansion could wait. Chapter 3. Electricity and Ambition. The house Frick purchased was not the house he intended to keep. He commissioned immediate renovations from Andrew Peebles, a Pittsburgh architect with experience in domestic transformations. The interior design was assigned to D.S. Hess and Company of New York, a firm that understood how new money wanted to present itself. The goal was not merely comfort, the goal was modernity. Clayton became one of the first mansions in Pittsburgh to have electricity. The power came from a generator at Solitude, the nearby estate of George Westinghouse, the inventor and industrialist who was pioneering electrical systems. Frick and Westinghouse were neighbors in the literal sense and competitors in the broader sense, two men building empires that would reshape American life. The electrical connection between their properties was both practical and symbolic. The old world of candlelight and gas lamps was ending. The industrialists would illuminate the new world with technology they controlled. The house also received telephones, another cutting-edge luxury that only the wealthiest families could afford. The renovations took months. The Fricks moved into Clayton in early 1883. Their son Childs was born that March. The 11 rooms that had seemed adequate when Frick purchased the property immediately felt cramped. The family expanded faster than the house. Martha Howard Frick arrived in August of 1885. Helen Clay Frick was born in September of 1888. The house filled with children's voices, nurses, servants, the accumulated disorder of young family life. Frick's business interests expanded in parallel. Carnegie Steel grew larger, more profitable, more dominant. Frick's personal wealth multiplied. His social position rose. By 1891, the family and the Frick's social stature had outgrown the house as it was. Frick hired Frederick John Osterling to solve the problem. Osterling was Pittsburgh's leading architect, a man who had studied in Europe and returned to design the city's most important buildings. He had created Allegheny High School, the Union Arcade that Frick himself owned, the Washington County Courthouse. His residential work included Charles Schwab's mansion in Braddock and Henry Heinz's estate called Greenlawn. When Pittsburgh's industrial elite needed architecture that announced power, they hired Osterling. The commission called for transforming the 11-room house into a chateau suitable for one of America's wealthiest families. Osterling designed a 4-story structure in the Loire chateau style, a romantic interpretation of French Renaissance architecture that was becoming fashionable among the American rich. The expansion added turrets and a balcony. It created a butler's pantry, an enlarged kitchen, a scullery, and cold storage rooms. The house grew from 11 rooms to somewhere between 22 and 24, depending on how servants' quarters were counted. Construction began in 1891. That same year, Martha died. She was 6 years old. The exact cause remains disputed, but family records indicate she swallowed a pin, possibly during a trip to Europe. The injury caused excruciating pain that lasted for years. Medical intervention proved useless. The child suffered while doctors watched. When she finally died, the family's grief turned pathological. The house under construction became a monument to a dead child. Every room would carry the weight of her absence. The expansion was completed in 1892. The result was architecturally impressive. The pale stucco exterior and chateau-style turrets gave Clayton the appearance of European permanence, as if the house had stood for generations rather than decades. The interior combined modern convenience with historical reference, electric lighting throughout, and modern plumbing, but decorative elements that suggested old-world cultivation. Frick had built a house that announced arrival while denying the rawness of industrial wealth's origins. On July 8, 1892, Adelaide Frick gave birth to a son. They named him Henry Clay Frick, Jr. The boy lived less than a month. He died on August 3rd, 11 days after an anarchist burst into his father's office and tried to murder him. The house that had been expanded to accommodate a growing family instead became a repository for dead children. 2 of 4 had not survived. The expansion that was supposed to celebrate prosperity had coincided with tragedy. The walls would never forget. Chapter 4. The Battleground. In June of 1892, as workers finished installing the turrets on Clayton's roof, Frick prepared for war. The contract between Carnegie Steel and the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers was set to expire on June 30th. Frick had no intention of renewing it. He wanted the union destroyed. Andrew Carnegie, conveniently vacationing at his castle in Scotland, had given Frick complete authority to handle negotiations. This was not coincidence. Carnegie could maintain his public position as a friend of labor, while Frick absorbed the hatred that union breaking generated. On April 30th, Frick announced a 29-day deadline for reaching a new agreement. He simultaneously proposed a 22% wage reduction that would affect nearly half the union's membership. When union leaders attempted to negotiate, Frick refused to meet them. He had already decided on confrontation. In late June, he locked out the entire workforce at the Homestead Works. 3,800 men found themselves barred from the plant they had operated. Frick ordered the construction of a fence around the mill property, 12 feet high, topped with barbed wire, equipped with searchlights and platforms for armed guards. Workers called it Fort Frick. Frick's plan was simple and brutal. He would reopen the plant on July 6th using strikebreakers protected by private security forces. He hired 300 agents from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, essentially a private army available to the highest bidder. The Pinkertons assembled at the Davis Island Dam on the Ohio River on the night of July 5th. They were given Winchester rifles and loaded onto 2 barges. The plan was to approach Homestead by water, land before dawn, and occupy the plant before the locked-out workers could react. The workers had spies. They knew the Pinkertons were coming. When the barges approached the Homestead landing at dawn on July 6th, thousands of workers and their families lined the riverbank. Someone fired the first shot. Who fired it remains disputed. What followed is not. A 12-hour battle erupted. Workers and Pinkertons exchanged gunfire across the Monongahela River. The Pinkertons attempted to land. The workers drove them back with bullets, dynamite, and burning oil poured onto the water. By the time the Pinkertons surrendered in the afternoon, 10 men were dead, 3 Pinkertons and 7 workers. 60 to 70 were wounded. The surrendered Pinkertons were marched through a gauntlet of furious workers and their families. They were beaten, kicked, and pelted with stones. Some barely survived the journey from the barges to the town. The violence shocked the nation. But public sympathy remained largely with the workers. Frick had provoked the battle. Frick had hired the private army. Frick had chosen confrontation over negotiation. 6 days later, Governor Robert Pattison dispatched 8,500 Pennsylvania National Guard troops to Homestead. The mill was occupied. Martial law was declared. Frick began hiring replacement workers. The union's power was broken, but Frick had become the most hated man in America. On Saturday, July 23rd, a young anarchist named Alexander Berkman entered Frick's office in downtown Pittsburgh. Berkman was 21 years old, a Russian immigrant who had plotted the assassination with his lover, Emma Goldman. They believed that killing Frick would spark a workers' revolution. Berkman wore a new black suit purchased specifically for the occasion. He carried a cheap revolver and a steel file sharpened into a dagger. He burst through the office door shortly after Frick had returned from lunch. He fired at nearly point-blank range. The first bullet struck Frick in the left earlobe, penetrated his neck near the base of the skull, and lodged in his back. Frick attempted to rise. Berkman fired again, hitting him in the neck a second time. Blood sprayed across the desk. John George Alexander Leishman, Carnegie Steel's vice president, grabbed Berkman's arm, preventing a third shot that might have been fatal. Frick and Leishman tackled the assassin. Berkman pulled out the sharpened file and stabbed Frick 3 times in the legs. A carpenter working nearby heard the commotion and struck Berkman in the head with a hammer. The blow stunned but did not stop him. deputies arrived and dragged Berkman away. Frick, bleeding extensively from neck and leg wounds, stopped a deputy from shooting his attacker. He gasped out instructions. The company would pursue the same policy. It would win. Doctors were summoned. Frick was rushed to Clayton. The bullets were extracted without anesthetic. Frick refused sedation, insisting he needed to remain conscious to continue directing company operations. Within a week, he was back at his desk. Within a month, the strike was effectively over. By November 20th, the union formally surrendered. 2,500 workers had lost their jobs. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers was destroyed. Frick had survived assassination and crushed the most powerful union in American steel. 11 days after the shooting, Henry Clay Frick Jr. died at Clayton. The infant was less than a month old. The cause of death was not recorded with specificity. Whether the trauma of the assassination attempt contributed to the child's death cannot be determined. What is certain is that in less than 2 months, Clayton had seen the birth of an heir, the attempted murder of its owner, and the death of that heir. The strike was broken. The union was destroyed. Frick survived. The house absorbed all of it. The blood, the grief, the survival. Chapter 5. The Empire Beyond the Walls. The man who recovered at Clayton in the summer of 1892 was both stronger and more isolated than before. Stronger because he had survived bullets and a sharpened file and the hatred of thousands. Isolated because survival had required a coldness that made normal human connection nearly impossible. He was also richer. Carnegie Steel's profits continued to grow. Frick's share of those profits made him one of the wealthiest men in Pennsylvania. Clayton remained the family's primary residence through these years. Frick could reach his downtown office in half an hour by train. He preferred the East End to the city center, the illusion of pastoral calm, to Pittsburgh's industrial chaos. But the relationship with Carnegie was deteriorating. The assassination attempt had revealed fault lines. Carnegie, safe in Scotland, had avoided the violence entirely. Frick had absorbed bullets meant for both of them. The resentment festered. In 1894, Frick became honorary chairman of the board, a title that meant Carnegie was pushing him aside. 5 years later, Carnegie abolished Frick's position as chairman of H.C. Frick Coke Company. The two men who had built an empire together went to court. In March of 1900, they reached a settlement. Frick received $30 million in securities, approximately $1.1 billion in today's currency. He became the largest individual railway stockholder in the world. The partnership that had remade American industry ended in litigation and mutual contempt. A year later, Frick joined the board of directors of J.P. Morgan's newly incorporated United States Steel Corporation. The company was formed by consolidating Carnegie Steel and multiple competitors into a single entity that would dominate global steel production for decades. Frick had been instrumental in creating the conditions that made the merger possible. His compensation reflected his value. He was not merely wealthy, he was wealthy at a scale that defied comprehension. From Clayton, he managed an expanding real estate empire. He owned extensive properties throughout Pennsylvania. In 1906, he completed construction of Eagle Rock, a summer estate at Pride's Crossing, Massachusetts. The house contained 104 rooms. It sat on acres of carefully landscaped grounds overlooking the Atlantic. The Frick family would spend summers there, escaping Pittsburgh's industrial heat for New England's coastal elegance. But Frick's primary focus beyond business was art. He had made his first recorded purchase in February of 1881, a landscape by local Pittsburgh artist George Hetzel. Through the 1880s, operating from Clayton, he built a collection of French Barbizon school paintings that demonstrated increasingly sophisticated taste. Works by Theodore Rousseau and other 19th-century European masters filled the walls. By the 1890s, Frick was spending months each year in Europe, traveling with Adelaide and Helen, visiting galleries and private collections, acquiring paintings that would eventually be recognized as among the finest examples of their kind. The art was not investment, it was passion. J.P. Morgan collected to increase his wealth. Frick collected because the act of possession brought something that money alone could not provide: The paintings offered beauty that existed independent of the violence that had funded their purchase. A canvas by an old master carried no memory of Homestead. A French landscape contained no trace of crushed strikes. Art was transformation. It converted blood money into culture. Life at Clayton reflected this duality. The house employed a full staff. Spencer Ford served as chef from approximately 1895 to 1916, working closely with Adelaide to plan elaborate meals. The surviving children, Childs and Helen, grew up in an environment that combined material abundance with emotional austerity. The dead siblings were never forgotten. Martha's death and Henry Jr.'s death shaped the household's atmosphere. Grief coexisted with opulence. Mourning coexisted with French cuisine and electrical lighting and European art. The family entertained Pittsburgh's elite. Andrew Mellon and his brother Richard visited. Andrew Carnegie, despite the business enmity, maintained social contact. Industrial titans, bankers, politicians cycled through Clayton's dining room and parlor. The house functioned as both residence and command center. Frick conducted business from his home office. Decisions that affected thousands of workers were made in rooms decorated with paintings that cost more than those workers would earn in their lifetimes. By 1905, Frick had outgrown Pittsburgh. The city had made him wealthy beyond measure. It had also made him infamous. The Homestead Strike remained a stain that no amount of art collecting could remove. Workers spat when his carriage passed. Anarchists continued to threaten his life. Pittsburgh meant power, but it also meant permanent association with violence. Frick decided to leave. Chapter 6. The Preservation Begins. When the Fricks left Clayton in 1905, they left most of their lives behind. Furniture remained in place. Art stayed on the walls. Children's toys sat in the nursery. Books filled the library shelves. The departure was not abandonment. It was something stranger. The family intended to maintain Clayton as a secondary residence, a place they would visit periodically, particularly at Christmas, but they also understood they would never return permanently. Pittsburgh had given them everything they possessed. They were walking away from it. The move to New York was both geographic and social. Frick leased the Vanderbilt Mansion at 640 Fifth Avenue, a temporary arrangement while he planned something more permanent. In 1907, he purchased land at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 70th Street. The lot had been occupied by the Lenox Library, a distinguished but financially struggling institution. Frick bought the building and demolished it. Construction of the new Frick Mansion began in 1912. The architects were Carrere and Hastings, with Thomas Hastings taking the lead on design. The commission called for a Beaux-Arts palace that would serve dual purposes. Frick would live there. After his death, the building would become a public museum. The design incorporated this future transformation. The first floor featured gallery spaces sized to accommodate major paintings. The rooms could function as domestic spaces during Frick's lifetime and exhibition halls after his death. He was building his own mausoleum, though he intended it to house art rather than his body. The total cost approached $5 million, including the land, approximately $150 million in today's currency. The house required a staff of 27 people to serve 3 residents: Frick, Adelaide, and Helen. Childs had established his own household. The mansion at 1 East 70th Street represented wealth at a scale that made Clayton look modest. The Pittsburgh house had cost $25,000. The New York house cost 200 times that amount. The differential measured how far Frick had traveled from his Mennonite childhood. Throughout this transformation, Clayton remained largely untouched. A minimal staff maintained the property. The rooms were cleaned. The gardens were tended. When the family returned for holidays, the house stood ready. But 93% of the original contents never moved to New York. The art that mattered most went to Fifth Avenue. The personal artifacts, the furniture. The domestic accumulation of 22 years stayed at Clayton. The house became a kind of museum before museums were planned. Helen divided her time between New York and Pittsburgh. She had been educated by a Swiss governess at Clayton, then sent to finishing school at Miss Spence's School for Girls. In New York, graduating in 1908, she had made her social debut in Pittsburgh in 1906. By age 17, she had visited Europe 9 times, accompanying her father on art-buying expeditions, keeping detailed diaries of galleries and museums. She understood that her father's passion for art would define her own life. In April of 1912, the family booked passage on the maiden voyage of the RMS Titanic. They would return to New York from Europe in style aboard the most luxurious vessel ever built. Adelaide sprained her ankle in Italy. The injury seemed minor. It saved their lives. The Fricks canceled their passage. The Titanic sailed without them and sank on April 15th, taking more than 1,500 people to the bottom of the Atlantic. The near miss became family lore, another piece of evidence that the Fricks survived when others did not. Frick maintained legal residency in Pennsylvania for the rest of his life. He returned annually to vote. Pittsburgh was where his empire had been built. New York was where that empire would be displayed. The distinction mattered. On December 2, 1919, Henry Clay Frick died of a heart attack at his Fifth Avenue mansion. He was 69 years old, 2 weeks short of his 70th birthday. His will divided his fortune with precision. He left Clayton and the surrounding property to Adelaide. He left 151 acres adjacent to the estate to the city of Pittsburgh for use as a public park, along with a $2 million trust fund for maintenance. He left his Fifth Avenue mansion and its contents to become a public museum. With a $15 million endowment, he left $6 million to Princeton University. Substantial bequests went to Harvard, MIT, hospitals throughout Pennsylvania, and charitable organizations in the regions where he had made his fortune. Of his $142 million estate, approximately $117 million went to charitable causes. $25 million went to his family. He had been ruthless in acquiring wealth. He was systematic in distributing it. Chapter 7. The Daughter's Devotion. Helen Clay Frick was born at Clayton on September 3, 1888. She died there on November 9, 1984. Between those two dates, she spent 96 years ensuring that her father's name would mean art, not blood. The effort consumed her entire life. It shaped her personality, her relationships, her understanding of duty. She never married. She never had children. She had art. She had memory. She had Clayton. Her earliest memories were of her sister Martha's suffering. The pin that Martha swallowed caused pain that doctors could not relieve. Helen watched her sister die slowly over years. The experience created a household atmosphere of obsessive mourning that never fully dissipated. Even after Martha's death in 1891, even after the family moved to New York, the dead child haunted every family gathering. Helen's mother named subsequent daughters and granddaughters Martha in tribute. The name became a curse. Martha Frick Symington Sanger, Helen's great niece, was told years later that because her name was Martha, she carried the curse of the dead girl. Helen's education reflected her father's priorities. The Swiss governess Marika Ogies taught foreign languages, music, history, mythology, science, and mathematics at Clayton. Ogies became a close friend of the family, traveling with them frequently. After Helen attended Miss Spence's school and made her debut, she accompanied her father on art-buying trips. By age 17, she had visited the Louvre, the Uffizi, the Prado, the Pinakothek, the National Gallery. She had examined private collections across Europe. She had absorbed her father's passion for acquisition. After his death in 1919, Helen focused that passion on preservation. She served, along with her mother and brother Childs, as a founding trustee of the Frick collection. She was instrumental in the museum's early acquisitions, guiding purchases that filled gaps in her father's collection. But her primary memorial was the Frick Art Reference Library, which she founded in 1920 as a public resource for art history research. She served as director from its inception until shortly before her death, 63 years of continuous leadership. The library began in the bowling alley of the Fifth Avenue mansion. In 1924, a separate building was constructed to house the growing collection of photographs and archival records documenting Western art. In 1935, a 13-story building replaced the original structure. The library became one of the most important research institutions in the world, preserving images and documentation of artworks that were subsequently lost or destroyed in 2 world wars. Helen had created something that outlasted art itself, a record of beauty that survived the destruction of the originals. Her relationship with her brother Childs deteriorated after their father's will was read. Henry Clay Frick had favored Helen. The financial imbalance created resentment that never healed. Brother and sister were estranged for the rest of their lives. Childs pursued paleontology, leading scientific expeditions and donating specimens to museums. Helen pursued art. They divided the family legacy and rarely spoke. Helen's other great project was the establishment of an art history department at the University of Pittsburgh. In 1926, she helped found the academic program. In the 1960s, she provided funds to construct the Frick Fine Arts Building to house the department and its library. The gesture was intended to anchor her father's legacy in his home city. It ended in acrimony. Disagreements arose over the employment of Germans at the university. Helen's experience during World War I had instilled an intense hatred of Germans that she never overcame. She witnessed the devastation in France during a post-war trip. The trauma calcified into permanent animosity. She banned people with German names from using the Frick Art Reference Library in New York. When the University of Pittsburgh hired German faculty and acquired modern art that Helen despised, she severed ties. In 1970, she withdrew her support and built the Frick Art Museum on the grounds at Clayton to house her personal collection. The museum she created was designed by Pittsburgh architects Pratt, Schaefer, and Slowick in the Italian Renaissance style. It featured Helen's collection of French 18th century painting and decorative arts and early Italian Renaissance painting. Works by Rubens, Boucher, Giovanni di Paolo, and Sassetta filled the galleries. The museum opened in 1970, giving Helen complete control over how her collection was displayed and who could access it. She had fought with universities, museums, and family members over her father's legacy. She had won every fight. Throughout her life, Helen divided her time between multiple residences: Clayton in Pittsburgh, Eagle Rock in Massachusetts, a farm in Bedford, New York, which she later donated as the Westmoreland Sanctuary Nature Preserve, the Frick Art Reference Library in New York. She never married, though she maintained close friendships. She devoted herself to institutions rather than individuals. The art, the library, the museums, the preservation of her father's reputation consumed her energy. In 1981, at age 93, Helen returned to Clayton to live full-time. She had spent part of each year there since childhood, but now she made it her permanent residence. She maintained a full staff. She kept the second floor as family archives, preserving documents that spanned nearly a century. She lived in the house where she was born, surrounded by furniture and objects that had been there since the 1880s, waiting. When Helen Clay Frick died on November 9, 1984, she left a personal estate estimated at $15 million. She left instructions that Clayton be restored exactly as it was when her family lived there. She left provisions for opening the house to the public. She had spent 96 years connected to one building. She understood that its value was not architectural, its value was testimonial. Clayton preserved a complete record of how industrial wealth lived at the turn of the 20th century. She was giving that record to strangers. Chapter 8. Forensic Preservation. The restoration began immediately after Helen's death. The team assembled by the Frick Pittsburgh faced a paradox. They were restoring a house that had never really been abandoned. Nearly all of the original contents remained in place. Helen's archives on the second floor contained photographs, invoices, inventories, and correspondence spanning generations. The house itself was evidence. The challenge was not to recreate, but to reveal. The budget was established at $6 million, approximately $18 million in today's currency. The office of Thierry W. Despont developed the initial planning document and served as supervising architectural firm. Urban Design Associates of Pittsburgh and Peters Building Company were brought in as local supervising architects and general contractor. Numerous specialty subcontractors handled roofing, painting, plastering, and restoration of stone and wood details. Decorative arts consultants from the Preservation Society of Newport and Winterthur examined the interiors and furnishings. The team's first decision was temporal. Clayton had evolved through multiple periods. Which version would they restore? The answer came from the house's own significance. The family had lived at Clayton as their primary residence from 1883 to 1905, Within that span, 1892 stood out. It was the year of the major expansion. It was the year of the Homestead Strike. It was the year the family was complete. Before death reduced it. 1892 became the target. Documentary evidence proved crucial. The team found Frederick Osterling's original blueprints for the 1891 to 1892 expansion. Invoices from vendors who had worked on Clayton through the years provided details about materials and finishes. Photographs from the family archives showed room configurations and furniture placement. A 1906 inventory listed the contents of each room with precision. The archival record was so complete that restoration became archaeology. The kitchen posed unique challenges. Helen's archives contained an 1892 photograph showing Chef Spencer Ford sitting beside the range, a rag rug on the floor, a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, copper pots on the stove. Through the doorway to the scullery, an open cupboard and a rolling stool were visible. The photograph provided spatial relationships. Osterling's blueprints provided dimensions. Together they allowed complete reconstruction. The team also consulted Mrs. Seeley's cookbook, published in 1902, which featured model kitchens of the period. While larger than Clayton's kitchen, the illustrations showed typical layouts and equipment. The restoration combined documentary evidence with period context to recreate a working Victorian kitchen. The electric annunciator system was discovered during the work. Mother-of-pearl buttons in each room connected to a board in the kitchen, allowing the family to summon servants without shouting. The system was preserved in working order. Physical work began in February of 1989 and concluded in October of the same year. 9 months of intensive labor returned Clayton to its 1892 appearance. Paint analysis revealed original colors. Worn textiles were replaced with historically accurate reproductions. Light fixtures were cleaned and rewired to modern electrical standards while maintaining period appearance. The greenhouse was rebuilt based on the 1897 Alden and Harlow structure. Cornelia Power Sal Inoway Pixel Ardentau, incorporating original elements that had survived. Throughout the process, the guiding principle was preservation rather than recreation. The extraordinary completeness of original furnishings meant that most objects simply remained where they had always been. The high chair in the breakfast room was original. The children's toys in the nursery were original. The copper pots in the kitchen were original. The restoration team was not furnishing a house. They were revealing one that had been waiting for a century. When Clayton opened to the public in October of 1990, visitors encountered something unprecedented in American house museums. They walked into a space that was not an approximation or interpretation, but an actual domestic environment from the Gilded Age. Susan Mary Alsop wrote in Architectural Digest that Clayton was, quote, 3. The assessment was accurate. The house felt inhabited. The family seemed to have left for vacation last week, rather than a century ago. The success depended on what the Fricks had preserved. Other wealthy families sold their past. They dispersed collections at auction. They demolished houses when fashions changed. The Fricks kept everything. Helen, in particular, understood that preservation was responsibility. The house contained evidence of how her family lived, how industrial fortunes functioned, how the Gilded Age operated. That evidence was too valuable to discard. She had protected it for decades. The restoration made it accessible. But the house that emerged from restoration was different from the house that entered it. Clayton in 1892 had been a private residence where a family absorbed tragedy and celebrated prosperity in equal measure. Clayton in 1990 was a museum where strangers examined that history. The transformation from home to testimony changed the building's meaning. It no longer belonged to the Fricks. It belonged to everyone. Chapter 9. The last witness walk down Penn Avenue today, and you will see Clayton. You will not see anything else from the world that built it. George Westinghouse's mansion Solitude, which provided the electrical generator that powered Clayton's lights, was demolished decades ago. A parking lot occupies the site. Andrew Carnegie's properties in the neighborhood are gone. The Mellon estates are gone. Dozens of other mansions that once lined what was called Millionaire's Row have been replaced by development that acknowledges no memory of what preceded it. Clayton survived because one family owned it for 102 years. From 1882, when Henry Clay Frick purchased the property, to 1984, when Helen Clay Frick died, the house never changed hands. It was never sold to developers. It was never subdivided into apartments. It was never abandoned to decay. Continuous ownership preserved what discontinuity destroyed everywhere else. The other mansions faced different fates. Some were demolished during the Great Depression when families could no longer maintain them. Some fell to highway construction and urban renewal in the 1950s and 60s. Some were converted to institutional use and subsequently abandoned when institutions moved. Point Breeze changed from an enclave of industrial wealth to a mixed neighborhood where the past existed only in street names and foundations visible in vacant lots. Clayton became an island of preservation in a sea of erasure. What makes the survival significant is not architecture. The building is impressive, but not exceptional. Frederick Osterling designed more important structures. The Loire château style was common among Gilded Age estates. The materials and craftsmanship, while excellent, were typical for wealthy residences of the era. Clayton matters because of what it contains. The astonishing preservation of original furnishings, the 10,000 objects ranging from toys to art to kitchen implements, the complete domestic ecosystem of a Gilded Age household, kept intact. Most house museums recreate period environments using objects assembled from multiple sources. Furniture is borrowed or purchased to suggest how a room might have looked. Art is selected to represent tastes of the era. The result is historically informed approximation. Clayton offers something different. Visitors see the actual objects the Frick family used, the actual art they purchased, the actual toys their children played with, the actual copper pots their chef cooked with. The distinction transforms tourism into witness. The educational value is correspondingly unique. Clayton shows how industrial wealth operated. The electric annunciator system that summons servants reveals the machinery of domestic comfort. The children's scaled furniture shows attention to detail that required staff to implement. The art collection shows cultural aspiration funded by industrial dominance. The house does not explain these relationships, it displays them. Visitors make their own connections. Those connections are complicated by knowledge of how the wealth was generated. The Homestead Strike cannot be separated from the house it funded. The workers killed on July 6, 1892, died so that Henry Clay Frick could maintain the power that built Clayton. The assassin who shot Frick on July 23rd was motivated by rage at that violence. The infant who died on August 3rd was caught in the aftermath. The house witnessed all of it, the beauty and the brutality, the art and the blood, the elegance and the broken union. The Frick Pittsburgh acknowledges this complexity through the title of its primary tour. _quote_4_ makes a distinction that matters. The Gilded Age was a period of astonishing wealth creation and devastating social inequality. The mansions were gorgeous. The labor conditions that funded them were horrific. Clayton presents both without resolving the tension. Docent-led tours provide context about Frick's role in crushing the Union and his role in building one of America's great art collections. The house allows contradictions to coexist. Since opening in 1990, Clayton has welcomed hundreds of thousands of visitors. Current attendance exceeds 100,000 annually. School groups study the domestic architecture of the period. Scholars research Gilded Age social history using Helen's archives. Tourists photograph the salmon-colored exterior and tropical gardens. The house serves multiple audiences without privileging any single interpretation. It is simultaneously historic landmark, research resource, and popular attraction. The surrounding complex enhances the educational mission. The Frick Art Museum, built by Helen in 1970, displays her collection of French and Italian art. The Car and Carriage Museum shows vehicles from the turn of the 20th century, including Frick's 1914 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost and Howard Heinz's 1898 Panhard, reputed to be the first automobile in Pittsburgh. The greenhouse, rebuilt based on the 1897 Alden and Harlow design, grows vegetables and flowers in partnership with Grow Pittsburgh. The 10 acres of grounds provide walking paths through gardens that approximate the estate's original landscaping. What Clayton preserves is not nostalgia. The Gilded Age was not golden. The wealth that built the mansion was extracted from workers who had no share in the profits they generated. The beauty of the house does not erase the ugliness of its financing, but preservation allows examination. Clayton survived not because the Fricks were better than their neighbors, but because they were more stubborn. They did not sell when others sold. They did not abandon when others abandoned. They kept everything. In doing so, they preserved evidence of a world that preferred to forget itself. Chapter 10. The Building Remembers. On May 23, 2025, the National Park Service added Clayton to the National Register of Historic Places. The designation recognized the house as one of more than 100,000 sites and buildings worthy of preservation. It joined more than 200 such locations in the Pittsburgh area alone, including neighboring Frick Park, the downtown Frick Building, the Allegheny County Courthouse, numerous Carnegie libraries, and Kennywood Amusement Park. The recognition seemed overdue. Many assumed Clayton had been registered decades earlier. It had not. The designation came as the Frick Pittsburgh launched a $10 million exterior preservation project. Phase 1 concluded in June of 2025. Phase 2 was scheduled to begin later in the year. The work addresses deterioration that a century of Pittsburgh weather has inflicted on the building's stucco, masonry, woodwork, windows, and roofs. The preservation includes replacing the current exterior paint with breathable waterproof paint in a more historically accurate color. Masonry is being repointed. Exterior metal, woodwork, and windows are being repaired and restored. Slate and flat roofs are being rehabilitated. To help fund the project and provide educational value during construction, the Frick Pittsburgh launched special restoration tours on June 21, 2025. Priced at $20 for non-members and $15 for members, the tours run on Fridays and Saturdays, showing visitors the ongoing preservation work. The initiative turns necessary maintenance into public engagement, demonstrating the continuous effort required to preserve historic structures. Future plans include interior improvements. Lighting throughout the house needs upgrading to modern museum standards while maintaining period appearance. The blue bedroom on the second floor requires restoration. These projects will unfold over years, funded by admission revenue, donations, and grants made possible in part by the National Register designation. The complex that surrounds Clayton reflects decades of development. The Frick Art Museum, designed in the Italian Renaissance style, opened in 1970 to house Helen Clay Frick's personal collection. The galleries display works by Rubens, Boucher, and Renaissance masters, alongside French 18th century furniture and decorative arts. The collection complements, but does not duplicate the art at the Frick Collection in New York, showing Helen's distinct taste and priorities. The Car and Carriage Museum underwent recent expansion and renovation to provide added space, higher ceilings, and better lighting. Visitors can see Frick's 1914 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost touring car, a vehicle that cost nearly $40,000 when new. Howard Heinz's 1898 Panhard, considered the first automobile in Pittsburgh, sits nearby. The collection illustrates the transition from horse-drawn carriages to motorized transportation, a transformation that Frick witnessed and embraced. The active greenhouse partners with Grow Pittsburgh to promote sustainable agriculture. Vegetables and flowers grow year-round in a structure that approximates the 1897 greenhouse designed by Alden and Harlow. The original greenhouse served the Frick family through the 1970s before deteriorating. The current structure, rebuilt during the 1980s restoration, combines historical authenticity with contemporary environmental education. The Playhouse, also designed by Alden and Harlow in 1897, was a center of activity for the Frick children. Helen and her siblings entertained guests there, including visits from Andrew Carnegie and the Mellon brothers. The structure has been preserved as part of the museum complex, showing how wealthy families provided spaces specifically for children's activities. The 10 acres of grounds feature lush gardens and a diverse selection of trees. Paths wind through plantings that suggest the estate's original landscaping while accommodating modern visitor access. The gardens are less elaborate than during the Frick family's residence, when full-time gardeners maintained tropical specimens that required constant care, but they preserved the sense of retreat that the family valued. Clayton opens Tuesday through Sunday, Admission requires advance time tickets. The signature tour, titled Quote 5, began on January 10th, 2026. The tour immerses visitors in the year 1892, a critical moment for the nation, Pittsburgh, and the Frick family. Docents guide groups through the 22 rooms, explaining daily life at the turn of the 20th century and providing context about Pittsburgh during the Gilded Age. The tour acknowledges both the technological progress and the social upheaval of the era. The title itself carries meaning. Quote 6 distinguishes between surface beauty and underlying value. The Gilded Age was a period of unprecedented wealth creation, built on exploitation that workers paid for with their lives and livelihoods. Clayton represents both the achievement and the cost. The house does not apologize for Henry Clay Frick's actions at Homestead. It does not celebrate them. It provides context that allows visitors to understand the connections between industrial violence and domestic elegance. Current preservation challenges are ongoing. Climate control is essential to protect the original furnishings and artworks. Security systems must be maintained and updated. Educational programming requires continuous development as new research emerges and visitor expectations evolve. Funding remains perpetual concern. The National Register designation helps with fundraising by making Clayton eligible for certain preservation grants and by raising the institution's profile nationally. The Frick Pittsburgh operates as a nonprofit cultural institution, dependent on admissions, memberships, donations, and grants. The $10 million exterior preservation represents years of fundraising and budget planning. The previous major restoration in the 1980s cost $6 million. The original house purchase in 1882 cost $25,000. The escalating figures show both inflation and society's increasing commitment to preservation. What was once a private residence purchased for a fraction of Frick's fortune now requires millions in public and philanthropic support to maintain. Clayton serves purposes that extend beyond tourism. Scholars use the house and Helen's archives to research Gilded Age social history, domestic architecture, art collecting, and labor relations. Students study primary sources that illuminate how industrialists lived and operated. Preservation specialists examine the restoration as a model for other historic houses. The institution contributes to ongoing conversations about wealth inequality, labor rights, and cultural heritage. The building that once belonged to one family now serves as public resource for understanding American history. The house provides evidence. Visitors see where Henry Clay Frick lived, what he collected, how his family functioned. They see the high chair in the breakfast room and know that children ate there. They see the electric call buttons and know that servants responded. They see the art on the walls and know what industrial fortunes purchased. They can make their own judgments about whether the beauty justifies the brutality or whether coexistence of the two reveals something about America that remains unresolved. Clayton opens Tuesday through Sunday. The restoration continues. The building remembers. More than a century after Frick left Pittsburgh, the house he built still stands. The salmon-colored stucco has been repainted. The gardens have been replanted. The greenhouse grows tomatoes instead of orchids, but the bones remain unchanged. 22 rooms arranged as they were in 1892, almost all of the contents original. A high chair in the breakfast room, toys in the nursery. Copper pots in the kitchen. Evidence. Clayton survived because one family kept it for 102 years. That family understood something about preservation that their neighbors did not. They understood that buildings remember. The walls that witnessed Martha's death and Henry Jr.'s death and the recovery from assassination also held dinner parties and Christmas mornings and children's laughter. All of it remains. The house does not distinguish between joy and grief. It keeps everything. The challenge for visitors is the same challenge that faced Frick himself. How do you reconcile beauty with brutality? The art he collected came from money earned by crushing strikes. The gardens were planted with profits from coke that choked the air. The children's playhouse was built in the same year that workers' children went hungry because their fathers had been locked out. These contradictions do not cancel each other out. They coexist. They always have. What makes Clayton valuable is not that it resolves these contradictions, but that it preserves them. The house does not apologize for Frick's actions at Homestead. It does not celebrate them. It simply shows where he lived, what he bought, how he raised his family. The visitor is left to make sense of it. This is harder than being told what to think. It is also more honest. Every Gilded Age mansion was built on someone's back. Clayton is the only one that survived intact enough to make that visible. When you stand in the restored kitchen and see the electric call buttons that summon servants, you can imagine the mansion functioning as a machine. When you see the art in the parlor, you can understand what that machine produced. When you learn about the homestead dead, you can calculate the cost. What you do with that evidence depends on what you bring to it. The restoration continues. The building remembers. Still standing. Still salmon pink. Still keeping secrets.